Hey guys, so today we are going to learn the first part of section or chapter 10. We are going to be learning about plants in this chapter. So, to start off, plants actually belong to the kingdom Plantae, which is a shocker, right? That's pretty important to remember and easy to remember. They are called producers. We talked about this earlier in the year, which basically means that they make their own food. So they collect energy from the sun to make sugar, and they are able to make food for themselves, and that also provides energy for us as humans to consume. Another important thing is they are eukaryotic and multicellular. Remember, some eukaryotic cells can be unicellular, but for plants specifically, they are eukaryotic and are multicellular. So they have multiple cells that make up the entire plant. And then they also are made up of a bunch of tissues that are organized, meaning that they have tissues that help move material from one place to another, called conducting tissues. They have tissues that give it stability. They have tissues for protection. So a lot of tissues make up the plant and keep it as a whole structure. They also have something called plastids that we will get into later, but basically plastids is a category specifically that things like chloroplasts fall into. Remember, chloroplasts are the ones that help with photosynthesis. So chloroplasts actually fall into the category of plastids, and like I said, we will get into that, but that's something that is important to plants. Another thing is that plants have cell walls containing cellulose, meaning plants have cell walls as an extra level of protection. Remember, they also have cell membrane, but in addition to the cell membrane, on the outside, they have cell walls that gives them rigidity, stability, and extra endurance that we, animal cells or human cells, do not have. And then cellulose is what gives the cell wall pretty much strength. And so the cellulose will actually be what is mainly makes up the cell wall. And I'll kind of write that here. So they make up cell wall. This is important because this is also what we eat. Humans actually cannot digest cellulose, so that's why when we eat a lot of vegetables, it's fiber, because the cellulose part of plants cannot be digested well. And so when we eat this, they kind of just move through our intestines, which is actually a good thing. Because they don't get broken down completely, they kind of move as a bulk through our intestines and kind of clean out our intestines with any gunk or bacteria that might be sitting in the corners of our intestines, which is actually really good for us. This is a table that is not in your notes, but just an introduction to plants. Basically, like I said, they are eukaryotic, multicellular. They have a bunch of tissues and they have some organs that we will learn about. They mostly have chlorophyll. Remember, chlorophyll is that green pigment. And then we talked about plastids, which are your chloroplast. Remember, chlorophyll is located inside of your chloroplast. And then all of their cell wall is made up of cellulose. They are autotrophic, which means they make their own food. And then we also have some that are heterotrophic or parasitic. We'll get into that as well. They reproduce sexually. That means they have female and male parts to them. We kind of looked at that in our genetic chapter, where we learned about how, Mendel was able to cross-pollinate between plants. And then they also have a form of asexual reproduction. This is, mainly, just when they are able to reproduce on their own. And then we also, they also are able to, like I said, with sexually reproduction. This is an example would be spores. And motility, which means how do they move. They are sessile or they can float, so some of them can stay in one place, or they can move around through the wind. They can get stuck on animal fur, and then the animals might sit somewhere and it might drop off. And then they also have gametes that are motile. So they can have gametes that are able to move and fertilize and therefore create a new organism. Okay, so getting into some organs of plants, we are talking about, first of all, what is the study of plants called? The study of plant is called botany. So you might have heard of botanists, which are people who study plants. They have, as their anatomy, they have a lot of parts that are both exterior, which are things that you can see, like the leaves that are in this diagram. You can see the root, the stem, you can see the nodes, the bud of a flower. And then they also have a lot of interior structure. So this is your chloroplast, your chlorophyll, and a couple other things that we'll talk about. And then, it's really important how these tissues and cells work together, because depending on how they work together depends on where the plant will live, what the function of the plant is going to be, so on and so forth. And some important organs that a plant has is one, the root, which you see in the picture. The root is what I'm circling in green. They also have stems, which is also seen in the picture, which let me do in red. So the stem is this whole thing right here. And then they also have leaves, which I know you all know what leaves look like, but I will circle it just in case you don't. So those are examples of organs that plants have. So plant organs are determined based on their nodes. So node is a big word that you need to know. Basically, a node is a region where a leaf is or was attached to the stem. So you can see that the node is right here, and that is a place where the leaf is literally being attached to the stem. You can see another node here without any leaves, so the leaves may be fallen off or something like that. But the node is really important because that is the point of attachment for the leaf to the actual stem of the plant. And like it says here, it's found in the stems. There are no nodes in the roots or the actual leaf itself. So you can't have, a leaf like this have a node coming off of it. But mainly you want to know that this is where the leaves are attaching to the stem. And that's what's called the nodes. Okay. All right, so let's talk about roots. A root system is basically just talking about all of the roots of a plant. So if I have this flower right here, I have this pretty purple flower, I have the stem, I have the leaves, and then I'm going to have some roots, okay? So all of these roots right here are called the root system. And why are they important for a plant? They're important for a plant because they help to anchor the plant to the ground, and they help to take water, and also there are minerals that are in the soil, nutrients and things like that the plant needs to function. And so they will take all of this up from the roots all the way up to the plant to go into the leaves, the stem, the flowers, the petals, so on and so forth. The roots can also have the ability to store food. And then there's also two types of roots we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about taproot. You don't have to write this down. You will see this in the next slide. And then we're going to talk about fibrous roots. So there's two different roots. But mainly the roots are super helpful in absorbing water, nutrients, minerals from the soil, and then also they help to store food, and then they also are classified into two types. So the taproot system has one or a few main roots that are thicker and longer than the other roots of the plant. So basically what this is if you've ever seen a carrot looks like this, right? But if you actually plucked a carrot from the ground, you'll notice that there are actually these tiny roots that come out of the carrot, okay? But the carrot itself is actually a root. So you're actually kind of eating the root of the plant, okay? So the carrot itself is a root, so it's called the taproot. But they have these tiny roots that come out, and these tiny roots that come out are called lateral roots. All right? So these lateral roots are kind of just extensions. Like I said, they're very small. They branch out from the main root, and you know, that is an example of a taproot. Dandelions are the same thing. When you have a dandelion plant like this, okay, you have a dandelion. Their roots, they actually have a main root that kind of looks like this, and then they have little roots that come out from the sides. And that's another example of a taproot system. So a taproot system is basically you have one thick, big root, and then you have tiny lateral roots. These little roots right here are lateral that come out from the main root itself. Another type of root is called fibrous root, okay? This is basically a cluster of roots that are all equal in size, and they have different branches. And an example is grass. If you've ever picked up a thing of grass, you might notice that they actually have a bunch of roots that come out of it. Okay, they're all about equal in size. There's no main root like we saw in the taproot, but they're just a bunch of them. And that is called fibrous roots. So it's just a big cluster, and they're all about equal in size, and they just branch out like crazy. And so that is an example of fibrous roots. Okay, so now we're going to talk about stems. So stem, one, is pretty much the main part here of a plant. This is where you have your node, which is this part right here that I just drew. And then you also have leaves that will come out of the node. Okay, but the stem is this middle green part. And it is important because one, it produces leaves. Two, it carries substances from the leaves to the roots, and then also from the roots to the leaves. So it goes back and forth. So examples of stems that you might see are actually trunks of trees. Those are an example of, stems. Branches, those are extensions of stems. Okay, tomato plants have these as well. So they help to mainly transport material, okay? That is the main job of stems, is to transport material. I'm sorry, guys. I meant to say that they help to transport material, but I wrote transport stems. So remember again, the main important job of a stem is to transport material from the roots to the leaves or leaves to the roots. Mainly it's going to be from, it can be from either end. Okay, there are two types of stems that we need to know. The first type is called a woody stem. These are really hard. They're not very flexible. They're strong with really thick cells, and they can hold up to a lot of weight. So these are like your trees, your smaller trees. They are able to, grow really big. If you run into a tree, the tree is not going to fall over usually unless it's a baby. You can't really bend a trunk of a tree. And trees we're going to learn about are made up of really durable, thick cells. And trees are able to hold a lot of weight. Like if you think about how much leaves and branches a tree holds, it's a ton. All right. So woody stem is kind of, you can imagine a tree trunk and then just think about all of the characteristics it has. It's hard, not flexible, super strong, holds a lot of weight. Then there's one called herbaceous stem, and these are a lot softer. They're more flexible than the woody stem. And so these are like your flowers, okay? There's some, plants that have stems that could be just greenery that are pretty flexible and soft. Those would be considered herbaceous, like for example, if you're growing like vegetables or something. And then they have sometimes supporting cells, basically cells that help them, sustain the structure of the stem itself. And one of the main ways that these stems are able to contain their structure and their look is through turgor pressure. So we learned about turgor pressure, which is when your cells of your plants have a lot of water and it allows them to look really rigid and stiff and firm. And when your cells have a lot of water, they are able to help the stem to actually stand up straighter and look really healthy. Versus, sometimes you might see a plant that's tilted over or tilted down or wilted and doesn't look healthy. It's because they don't have turgor pressure to keep the stem from standing up. And then another important thing is that when you have a plant, especially in a woody plant, the woody plants actually all start off with having a herbaceous stem. So a tree is actually going to start off with having this kind of stem, soft, flexible. As it grows up, it will start to develop the cells that it needs to make a woody stem, and therefore it will grow stronger and thicker. So leaves are an important part of plants, right? All plants that you see have some kind of leaf associated with them. So what is a leaf? It is a flat green part of the plant, and they have something called the blade. The blade is the actual leaf that we are talking about. So if this is our leaf, this would be called the blade. Now, blades can come in different kind of looks. They can either be smooth, which is what you just saw me draw right here. They can be toothed, which is like they kind of have these little ridges on them. Or they can be deeply lobed, so they kind of look like this, right? But those are different forms of what a leaf can look like, specifically what a blade can look like. Now, there are something called a compound leaf. A compound leaf pretty much has a bunch of little leaves on it, and so they call those smaller pieces of the leaves or the blades that make up this compound leaf a leaflet. Okay, kind of cute, right? So a compound leaf kind of looks like this. They have one kind of like stem, and then they have little leaves that come off the stem, and those little leaves are then called the leaflet. Okay, so this is an example of a compound leaf right here. A simple leaf only has one blade on the petiole, and then a compound leaf has individual leaflets. So the top part is what we see as the simple leaf. So there's just one single leaf per petiole. And then a compound leaf that we see right here has a bunch of little leaflets. Remember these little leaves? All these little leaves are called leaflets, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about leaves. There's something important that all leaves have, and these are called veins, okay? Veins are helpful because they are the ones that are carrying water and sugar through the actual plant in order to make sure that the plant is well nourished. So veins are called conducting tissues. That is the main name that we have for veins. And there's a couple different forms of veins that we can see. One is called parallel, one's called palmate, and one is called pinnate. So let's talk about this. Parallel venation, whenever you hear the word venation that you see in all these three forms, those are referring to veins, okay? So parallel venation are larger veins and are parallel to each other. So if I have a leaf here and the veins would run like this, and those would be called parallel venation. You can see how the veins are parallel to each other. This would be like in your grass. Then there's palmate venation, which means that the veins that branch from the base of the leaf. Okay, so if I have a leaf, the veins would all just branch from the bottom of the leaf. Okay, so this is palmate. And over here, I said earlier, this is parallel. And then lastly, we have pinnate venation, which is you have a leaf. So let's draw a little different. You have one main vein coming from the base of the leaf, and then you have smaller branches of veins extending throughout the leaf as well. And then they'll be kind of going throughout the entire leaf, okay? So here are some examples and diagrams you can see. So we have some simple leaves here. You have pinnate leaves right here. Remember, pinnate are the ones that have one main branch, right? And then they have smaller veins coming out of that main branch. They have one main branch, and then they have smaller veins coming out of there. Then we have palmate, which is that they come from the base of the leaf. All of the veins do. So if you have a leaf, all of the veins will kind of branch from one part, which is the base. And then this one you don't really need to know, the bipinnately, but these main two right here are the ones that you really need to know, as well as the parallel veins that we talked about that grass exhibits. And they have the parallel veins kind of going like this. So remember, veins are super important because they are the ones that are carrying nutrients such as water and sugar throughout the plant. So kind of reiterating what I already said, venation is the arrangement of veins on a leaf. And then we have three types of venations. We have parallel venation, which you see right here. So this is your parallel. Then you have your palmate, which is what you see here. So you can see how you have the branches kind of coming out from the base of the main branches are coming out from the base of the leaf. And then you have pinnate, which is you have one main branch right here, and then you have all the other branches coming off here. Now I know you probably are like, but Mrs. Fry, I see little veins coming off of the ones that are, you know, extending throughout the leaf itself, like right here. That's true. But we're looking at the main veins that are exhibited in these types of leaves. And those are the ones that we are giving the name palmate, parallel, and then pinnate. So make sure you memorize this. Make sure you know how they look so that you can kind of come back to them when we're going further into leaves. So we talked about something called a petiole earlier. So what exactly is a petiole, right? So we already said that if we have a stem, we have a node, which is right here, and then we have a leaf that comes out of the node. The petiole is this part right here. Okay, this is the part that attaches the actual leaf to the actual node. All right. And so what happens is the veins that we see that I'm going to draw, excuse me, in the actual leaf is going to travel and converge and go through the petiole and then go into the actual stem. So all of these red veins that you see in the leaf, they will kind of converge, all meet up and go down the petiole, and then will go into the stem itself. Okay, so now that we talked about leaves, we are going to talk about how they are arranged. So if there is only one leaf attached at a node, the leaf arrangement is going to become called alternate. So usually what this means is that you'll have a leaf on a stem, and they will look like they're kind of going in an alternate pattern, okay? So this is the alternate formation of a leaf arrangement. If you have two leaves at each node, then they're going to be said to be called opposite. So I'll draw that over here. So if you have a node, remember that's where the petiole of the leaf attaches to. You will have, you can have two leaves attached at the same node, and that is going to be called opposite because they're opposite of each other. So in the first one, in the alternate, you can see that at each node, you still have only one petiole and one leaf coming out of it. But in opposite, you have two leaves coming out of the same node, or petiole coming out of the same node to give you 2 leaves. If you have 3 or more leaves per node, it's called whorled or whorled, which kind of sounds the same. But that basically can happen, like I said, if there's 3 or more. So that kind of looks like this. You have a node right there, and then you can have a bunch of leaves kind of coming out of that one node, okay? Sometimes you might see this in bamboo sticks, things like that. So here is an example and a much better drawing of what I just talked about. Alternate, you can see how at each node, which I am doing in blue, you have 1 leaf or 1 petiole and leaf coming out of it. And they're kind of in an alternate pattern. Opposite, you have 2 leaves coming out of 1 node, and they're just on the opposite side of each other. And then whorled, you have multiple leaves coming out of 1 node, and that's what they look like. So now that we talked about leaves, leaf arrangement, we talked about the different parts of a plant, we're going to talk about the internal structures. So there are 2 important parts of a plant. You have the cell wall, and then you have something called plastids. So let's talk about what a cell wall is first. So we talked about cell wall a couple chapters ago. This is the extra set of membrane that is on the outside of the plant, and is kind of shows it to be a second membrane. So remember that all plants, like animal cells, they have a cell membrane, but they have an additional thing called the cell wall to help support and bear the weight of the entire plant in itself. The cell wall is made up of something called cellulose, which is just made up of the building blocks of sugar. And cell wall is going to be very rigid, as in it's going to be very durable. Now, the important thing to also remember is that cellulose actually is something that we humans cannot digest very well. And so that's why a lot of the things that are fiber have a lot of cellulose in it. Since we can't digest cellulose, what happens is when we eat something that has a lot of cellulose in it, it kind of just moves through our intestine as like a bulb, or like as just a group of kind of substance, which is a good thing because it can actually clean out our intestines of things that might be stuck in the nooks and crannies. Our intestine kind of looks like, a little snake with a bunch of curves. So what happens is when you have cellulose go in, or when you eat things like meat or candy or things that are not as healthy, they get stuck in like the nooks and crannies of our intestines. But when you have something like cellulose, which is like fiber from plants, it actually goes down the intestine and it will grab all of the stuff that's been sitting there in your intestine that can actually make you sick. It can build up bacteria, it can cause stomach aches and bloating, and the cellulose will gather all of that and it will push it out, and then you poop it out, which is a good thing. Okay. Going along with cell wall, there's also something called turgor pressure. We talked about turgor pressure a lot. This is when you have a lot of water in your plant vacuole, so that it pushes on the plant cells and it makes the plant look stiff, which is good because this is what is actually supporting the leaves to make them look plump and healthy. It helps the plant to stand up tall. And it helps with the general structure and look of the plant. So this is an example of a plant that does not have enough turgor pressure. So you can see that it's wilted, it's looking really limp and not very lifelike, because there's not enough water in the plant cells to kind of push back on the cell wall, and therefore it looks like it's wilted and not healthy. So this is why it's important to make sure our plants have plenty of water and well taken care of, so that they will look nice and healthy. Continuing on with internal structure, we said that there's 2 parts, cell wall, which we talked about, and then plastids. So what exactly are plastids? So plastids are almost like a group that we can categorize chloroplasts under. Plastids are important for the plant to thrive because they help with photosynthesis, making energy, making food. So what do we use for photosynthesis? Before we talked about chloroplasts. So the chloroplasts are the organelles that are inside of plant cells, and they like to convert sunlight into food that we can then use as energy source, and then we as humans can also digest this for energy and food for us. So remember, they take light energy and convert it to chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. That's what we talked about in the last chapter. So chloroplasts, they also have something within themselves called chlorophyll. Remember, chlorophyll is the actual green pigment that is going to capture the light energy. So the chlorophyll specifically is the green pigment that gives the plants the color green, and they're also what captures the light energy from the sun. So chloroplasts are the organelle that contains chlorophyll. Chloroplasts there are plenty of them in plant cells, and they're actually even in plants that may not even look green, like tomatoes. But the chlorophyll in tomatoes, they make a red pigment. And then chloroplasts and plastids itself, they actually are a good place for storage for starch and oil as well. Okay, so like any organism has tissues, plants have tissues as well. So what is a tissue? A tissue, remember we talked about specifically, is a group of cells that make up tissues. Remember, cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, so on and so forth. Organs make up organ systems. So they're just known as a group of cells that specialize, okay? So tissues are specialized to a particular function. So this is why when we talked about, a human being as an organism, you can't have a heart tissue inside of a liver tissue. You can't have a liver tissue inside of a heart tissue, because they're specific for the function of whatever organ they're a part of. Same thing with plants. The important thing about plants is, one, tissues are specific for the function that they serve, and they also give support to the plant. They help to transport water from roots to the leaves, to the stem, to the flower, to the vegetables or fruit that they're producing. And they also help with photosynthesis. So one of the tissues that we are going to talk about is called the xylem. So what a xylem is it's made up these long, hollow cells, almost looking like straws. So they kind of look like this. They look like little, straws. And they help to make the cell wall pretty thick. And as the xylem grows, they also grow with the cell wall, and the cell wall becomes able to be more sturdy and durable. When you have mature xylem cells, they become really hollow in the center, so that you can have passageway for minerals, especially water, because that is what they transport. And they're going to connect end to end. So if you have one xylem like this, you'll have another one like this, you'll have another one like this, and they'll all kind of connect with each other. And inside, they're going to be hollow so that they can carry water, okay? So water is specific to xylem. Anytime you think of xylem, you need to think of the transport of water. And what they do is they take the water from the roots of the plant to the stems and then to the leaves. And so this is how the plant in its own is getting water all the way from the roots to the entire of the plant, so that they are well nourished. When we talk about trees, right, they're made out of wood. Wood is made up of layers of xylem that they have just built up and formed over years and years. The oldest xylem layer is going to be in the center of the wood. So if you ever looked at wood, you might have noticed, if you've seen like a cut wood, that they have all these rings. And if you count the rings, they'd say you can tell how old the tree or the plant is. So this is like if you cut a trunk in half. So the oldest xylem layer is actually going to be right in the center of it. And then the newest layer is going to be towards the outside right here. So this will be new, and then the middle one would be the old. There are specific names for them. So the old layer is known as the heartwood. And these, what happens is they start to get filled up with chemicals that makes it hard and rigid. So the old layer that we talked about right here, they will start to kind of become really hard and become very durable and stiff. Versus the new layer, which is on the outside, they are still going to be functioning in carrying water from the roots to the rest of the plant. And so the new layer of xylem is called sapwood. The old layer is called heartwood. You can kind of think of heartwood. The heart is in the center of your body, technically. And so that part is going to be very hard. And then the sapwood is going to be towards the outside of the body and outside of the tree trunk. And it's still going to perform the function of carrying water through the entire plant. And it's going to be located right under the bark. And we'll learn how the bark is actually dead. It's not a living thing. But xylem, because it's carrying water, is a lot more, it has life to it. Not necessarily like an animal would, but it has a function to carry water, and therefore it's not like dead skin, you would say, on a human cell, because dead skin on a human cell does not have capillaries, which are blood vessels. They don't have nutrients in them, just like the bark of a tree. But then as you go underneath our skin, you start to get to the blood vessels, you start to get to the nutrients. Same thing with the tree. Right under the bark of the tree, which is like the dead skin, you have the sapwood, which is alive and well because it's performing an important function of making sure that you get water. So this is an example of a tree trunk cut in half. You can see how it's labeled heartwood, which is kind of this entire part right here. And then you can see that it's labeled sapwood, which is this entire part right here. So the heartwood is the old xylem. And then the sapwood is the new xylem. And the new xylem is still transporting water. So now that we talked about xylem, there's also something called phloem. Now, phloem is specific for the sugar solution that it carries from the leaves of the plant, because remember, leaves is where you have photosynthesis occurring. And photosynthesis, you make sugar. So, phloem takes all the sugar that's being made by photosynthesis on the leaves, and it takes it to the other parts of the plant. It can also, transport some liquid, which will kind of be, the sugar will not be like sugarized crystals. It would be more of a liquid form, and it will carry it throughout the plant. These phloem cells are not completely hollow. And they are found on the outside of all the xylem layers, right under the outer bark. So you'll have the xylem layers, and then outside of the xylem layers, you will have the, so it will be phloem, xylem, and then the outer, it will be xylem, phloem, and then you'll have the outer bark of the tree. So like I said, the phloem will receive the sugar from the leaves, and it will send it to areas of the plant that need to be nourished, as well as areas of the plant that are still growing, because that's where you're getting the nutrients from to supply the growth to actually occur. So in leaves, especially of plants that are very young, and also in plants that don't have a bark or don't have a trunk or like that's woody, so things like petunias, which is a flower, or lettuce. The xylem and the phloem are actually going to be arranged in something called vascular bundles. Okay, so these vascular bundles are super important because these are pretty much acting like the veins of the leaves. And they have narrow tubes of xylem and phloem, which allows these young parts of the plants, like the petunias, younger petunias and baby lettuces, to have the water and the nutrients that they need to provide growth. Because remember, phloem, especially will take the sugar to areas that are still growing. So when you have a baby petunia or a baby lettuce, they are constantly growing. And so you will have these narrow tubes located in them to allow the nutrients that they need to allow them to grow to the full size that they need to be. The way that vascular bundles, which are xylem and phloem, so remember that anytime you hear vascular bundles of the plant, always remember that this is the xylem and phloem. They're going to be supported by thick-walled cells, all right? And those are the fibers, okay? And they have to be thick enough so that, because in some plants, you have really thick stems. So if you think about like a sugar cane or corn stalks, their stems are pretty thick. They're not, they're not very easy to break off. But they do have really long and narrow cells that make them up. And they're not going to be as hollow as you would see in certain other plants. And then as these fibers are starting to grow in plants, and as the plant itself starts to grow, they're going to form strong walls, and therefore they're able to give rigidity and strength to the plant. So, a new or baby corn stalk is not going to be as strong and durable as one that is mature and grown to its full height or to its adulthood. And so fibers help to support the cells that make up those stalks. And like I said, they are not hollow, but they come to kind of connect each other at the ends. And fibers can actually can be grouped together to make fiber tissue. So I'm just going to write that here. So fibers can be grouped together to make fiber tissues. And then you can use these fiber tissues to make ropes. You can make clothes. Okay, so there are a lot of functions that you can do. All right, so now we're going to talk about certain parts of a plant that are important. So the first thing is called the epidermis. We have epidermis on our skin. That is this part that you can look. So if you look down at your arm or your wrist, what you see is your epidermis, the outermost layer of your skin. Okay, so the epidermis is like our skin. It's the outermost tissue of the leaves. So this is what you are really seeing. The epidermis can also be part of roots and also part of stems. So the outer part of all these three, stems, roots, and leaves, are going to be called the epidermis. Just like the outer part of our skin is called the epidermis as well. And they are made up of flat cells. And these are important because they help the plant from losing water. They help, harmful things like bacteria or molecules from entering the cell or the plant that could harm them in any way. And then they also secrete a waxy substance that forms a protective covering called the cuticle. So the cuticle, you can actually see this very clearly on some plants. It almost looks like there's like a shine to them. And that's because this is what the epidermis is actually secreting. And this is an important part of the plant because, epidermis actually has like these small holes in them that we'll talk about that controls, what can come in and what can go out. And it's almost like a protective barrier that we have on the plant, just like our skins have the epidermis that we have as a protective barrier against viruses and bacteria as well. There's also, you probably heard of tree bark. And so the bark is the outside part of the, it's located on the outer part of the xylem. So you have, the outer part of the tree, which is, all what we call the bark. But it's located on the outside of the structure of the xylem. And between the xylem and the bark, you actually have a very thin layer of tissue called a vascular cambium. If you have larger trees, they can be a little bit larger than compared to a smaller tree. So the vascular cambium is very important because it has a job to make new xylem and new phloem cells. So this is an area that's actually live and functioning and important. So what happens is the vascular cambium will make these new xylem and phloem cells. And and then it will kind of push them towards the middle of the bark or the middle of the wood for the xylem, and then the phloem is going to be pushed towards the outside to form the inner part of the bark. So remember, we said the xylem, as it gets further and further inside of the wood, it's called heartwood, where it will start to kind of be filled in and become really strong and rigid. Well, that's what happens. So the older xylems will get pushed in, because you have these new xylems constantly being produced by the vascular cambium. And then you have phloem that gets pushed towards the outside, and it will kind of sit underneath the bark between the xylem and the bark itself for movement of sugar, which is an important part of your plant cells to have. So this is kind of like a look, the cork, cork cambium, cortex, phloem, all of this actually makes up the bark. So all of this right here is the bark. This is the outside of the cell. You can kind of see the rough, like brown exterior. Then you have this very thin layer of the vascular cambium right here that I have in purple. That's what is making those new phloem and xylem cells. And then you have the xylem, which is all this right here, that is kind of pushed towards the inside. Okay, so as the vascular cambium makes xylem, it will push it inside, and as the vascular cambium makes phloem, it will push it towards the outside. Continuing on with bark, the outermost part of the bark is going to be called the cork. So we kind of saw that in the last image. The cork is the outermost part of the bark. And this is made up of dead cells, which are super thick. And that's why when you touch the bark of a tree, you can see it's really dry and coarse, because all of that is dead. Usually when you pull off the bark, it kind of just falls or crumbles or just falls to the ground. But this is important because it actually has a waterproof coating that helps the plant keep away harmful substances, harmful organisms that could damage the tree or the plant. But it also makes sure that the moisture, like the water, the sugar that's being made inside, stays inside. Then you also have cork cambium. This is a live layer of cells. It's just going to be underneath the cork, and this is going to constantly be going through mitosis so that you're producing new cork cells. So the outermost part of the bark is going to be dead, but as you move inward, you're going to have layers of actually living cells. So the outer part of the cork, is dry and coarse, like I said, because it's dead, but the newer cells will be a little bit softer. And if you ever seen a bark and you kind of take off the whole outer part, you can kind of tell that the inside of it is a little bit more wetter and a little bit more squishier, because those are living and those are constantly being divided so that it can make new cork cells and push it towards the outside. When you have young cork cells, they will grow, they will start to form the thick cell walls, and then they will die. When they die, that's what forms the outer part of the cork. And then, like I said, it helps to mainly with protection, and you can have cork on, the trunk of the tree, on the branches, so on and so forth. So make sure you remember that the cork cambium is living, okay? These are constantly going through mitosis to produce new cork cells. And then as the, new younger cork cells mature, they will start to die and get pushed towards the outside to make the outer part of the cork. So barking up the wrong tree, this is something in your textbook that is on page 211. So I'll kind of write that right here. So if you want to read that, it's a good read. Basically, it talks about a tree being girdled. And what this means is that you have pretty much the bark of the tree, which we said was made up of the cork cambium, all of that stuff. And it gets stripped away from the trunk. And when this happens, you kind of are preventing the tree from growing, and you're preventing the tree from getting the nutrients that it needs. And so this tree actually starts to die because you are preventing phloem from doing its job of transferring sugar. When you strip away the bark of the tree, phloem is part of the bark of the tree. And so now you can't get sugar to the rest of the tree in order to supply it with nutrients, and therefore it starts to die. So this can be actually a really sad thing. What usually happens is you have like a tree, that's looks like that, and it has like all these, like, say this is the bark of the tree, the lines that I have. So during the girdling of the tree, you'll have kind of this like break right here. So the phloem can't now supply nutrients to the rest of the tree, and so the rest of the tree will start to die. Because remember, phloem carries sugar, so if it's carrying sugar from the leaves that are up here, right, it can't get to the rest of the tree down here, and so the rest of the tree will start to die, and eventually the upper part of the tree will die too, because the upper part of the tree now can't get the nutrients that it needs from the lower part of the tree if it gets worse than being impacted if it gets impacted on a deeper level. So then when you have the roots starting to die, the upper parts are also going to start dying. And this can, start to cause a lot of issues for the tree, because the tree will eventually start to die too. During the spring and early summer, the tree produces something called springwood. And these are basically just large xylem cells, okay? So springwood is just called large xylem cells. And the xylem that is made during the end of summer into fall is going to be a lot smaller, with thicker cell walls, because they have now matured, and it's called summerwood. So these are two important things that you should know: springwood and summerwood. Springwood, it starts in the spring into early summer, and then summerwood, it starts in the late summer into the fall. And then this is just, and during spring, your xylem cells, which carry water, are a lot more bigger, and then in the summer, they are a lot more smaller. So this is an example, an actual picture of girdling. So you can see how the bark is completely stripped away in this center part right here. And so now you can't get phloem from the leaves down, and you can't get water from the roots up. You can technically get water because the xylem is still in there, but if the phloem can't get down all the way to the roots, now the roots don't have sugar. The rest of the tree from this waist down aren't getting any sugar from the leaves, and so they're not getting any nutrients. Just water isn't enough. They still need to get nutrients from the photosynthesis that's occurring, and therefore they can the tree itself can start to die. Okay, so that's it for section 10A. I know it's a lot of terms, it's a lot of memorization that you need to do, so this is not something that you should be working on studying one night before the quiz. So we're going to do a quick quiz review on this section before we have your quiz. So one thing you need to remember is that all plants are eukaryotic. They have cell walls, and they are multicellular. These three things are super important for what a plant is. We also talked about if I have a stem like this, the node is where you have the actual petiole, which is this part, and the leaf attached to the stem. Then you can have two types of stems. You can have woody stems, which are hard and super strong, and you can have herbaceous stems, which are soft, flexible, and supported by turgor pressure, which is an important term to also know. So this is like your tree, and herbaceous stems are like your fruits and veggies that have this, or even like flowers have this kind of stem. If you guys need to pause the video at some point so you can copy this down, please do. We also talked about veins. So veins are water and sugar conducting tissues in the leaves, and they can be, parallel or branched. So veins are literally the messenger system or the messenger pathways throughout the plant or throughout the leaf. So when you have a leaf, you have veins that are all in the leaf, and they will gather the sugar from photosynthesis that's occurring. They will gather water from the roots and bring it up to the leaves, and they will kind of have this passageway of transferring material. Veins can be categorized as being parallel or branched. So let's talk about the different types of veins that we talked about. We talked about palmate veins, which means that they branch from the base of the leaf. We talked about parallel, which is veins that are like this right here. They're parallel to each other, so this would be like your grass. And then you have pinnate, which are veins that extend throughout the leaf, but they have one main one, and then they have smaller veins coming out. So a pinnate would be something like this, and then they have like smaller veins coming out. Let me label that as pinnate. A parallel is what I said is up here. And then if you have palmate, you kind of have one vein coming from the base, as well as another coming from the base, as well as another coming from the base. Turgor pressure is super important because this is how the plant cell looks healthy. It's able to be stiff and healthy, and it's because of the water that it has in the cells that are able to apply pressure to the cell wall, and so then you can have nice, healthy looking plants. We talked about two types of roots. We talked about taproot and we talked about fibrous root. So a taproot is one main root with smaller roots that branch out. So that's like a carrot or a dandelion. So it kind of looks like you have one main root here, and then you have tiny little lateral roots. That's what we call the little ones. And then a fibrous root is if you have, say like you have grass or something. The fibrous roots would be coming out all over and kind of in the same size. They're all would be the same size as each other. We talked about springwood that occurs between late spring or during spring into summer, and then summerwood happens late summer into the fall, and this makes up the rings that you see on the tree trunk. So if you cut a trunk in half, you kind of see these rings, and that's what makes them up. We talked about two parts of a plant called the phloem and the xylem. Remember, the phloem is mainly for sugar solution, so it takes the sugar that is made in the leaves, and then it will take it to the rest of the plant. This is the job of the phloem. The xylem will take the water from the roots, and it will take it to the rest of the plant, whether it's the leaves or the stem or whatever. We talked about different parts of the bark. We said that the cork is the outermost part of the bark. It's usually the outermost part of the cork is made up of dead cells. That's why it's harder. And then you have the cork cambium, which is on the inside part of the cork. This is alive because it's making new cork cells, and it's constantly dividing through the process of mitosis. So as these cork cells become mature, they will start to die off and they get pushed towards the outside, where you will then have these cork cells that are dead kind of congregate to make the outer part of the bark. And that's it for our quiz review.